I'm Alex, 27, and last June I came home to an empty rectangle of dust in my parents' garage where my car used to be. The outline looked like a chalk drawing at a crime scene. Lighter concrete where the tires had sat, a clean shadow where the hood once kept the floor from fading. On a shelf above the vacancy, my blue shop towels waited in a neat roll like they expected me to come back and wipe grease off my hands. Under the shelf, a single 10mm socket glinted in a shallow tray, the same way it glints right before you drop it into an engine bay and lose it for a season. I stood there, keys in my fist, and understood the weirdest part first. The smell was gone. No oil, no coolant, no faint, hot metal sweetness. Just laundry soap from the utility room and my mother's lemon cleaner. There was a folded note on the workbench with my name. The handwriting was my dad's. It was short, careful, and confident in the way people write when they've already rehearsed a conversation a dozen times in their heads. I read it twice and then a third time, even though I knew reading wouldn't change what was missing. Words like family and emergency and you'll understand landed with the soft thud of small, heavy objects. If you want to picture the car, don't make it a showroom fantasy. It was a 2006 Subaru WRX wagon in steel gray with the kind of miles that tell you a previous owner enjoyed mornings. It was not exotic. It was mine in a way that felt like a degree I'd earned slowly. I bought it at 22 after saving from 2 years of warehouse shifts and weekend gig work, then learning how to sit on cash while Facebook Marketplace tried to convince me I deserved worse. I found it 3 towns over from a high school math teacher who kept a binder of maintenance records and apologized for a paint chip on the rear hatch that I already loved, for being honest. I signed the bill of sale with a pen the bank gave me for opening a checking account, and the ride home felt like I had just given myself permission to have a thing I wasn't immediately going to sell. I learned the card the way you learn a person you're serious about, by paying attention. The clutch had a point where it spoke back. The turbo woke up like a kettle. The hatch needed an extra push in cold weather. I bought used wheels off a forum and sanded them in the driveway until my forearms ached, then told myself the finish looked satin, even though it looked like a weekend with too much pride. On Sundays, I'd line up all my bottles, soap, clay, polish, wax, like little soldiers, and lose hours to circles and microfiber. My dad, who grew up with carburetors and resentment, would step out with coffee and make jokes about me polishing a commuter. He'd still hand me the 10mm when I asked, without making me feel like a child. If you're asking how a 27-year-old ends up with his car in his parents' garage, the story isn't dramatic. I took a 6-month field assignment with a civil engineering firm that had us bouncing between small sites in the state, and subletting my apartment made more sense than paying rent to store a sofa. I moved furniture into a cheap storage unit, took the WRX to my parents' place 2 suburbs over, and promised my mom I would label the bins. Title and registration lived in a fireproof box in their house, because that's where documents go in my family, behind birth certificates and my dad's list of passwords written in a code everyone in the house pretends is impenetrable. I left the car on trickle charge, covered, and made 2 mistakes I only recognized later. One, I left a spare key on the kitchen message board because my mom worries about everything that can be worried about, and I wanted her to sleep. 2, I never moved the title out of my dad's name. Back when I bought the car, he insisted we keep the registration under him for insurance purposes while I built history. I planned to fix it once the assignment ended. Planned does a lot of work in a sentence like that. The assignment was the kind of work that makes a person feel sturdy. Long days in boots, early mornings with bad coffee, traffic cones in the trunk, sunburn above the collar. I slept in a rotation of motels that all smelled like someone else's air freshener, and came home every other weekend to eat grocery store sushi with my mom at the counter while my dad complained about cable bundles. My sister, Erin, dropped by sometimes with her girls, and a weather system of her own. Bills, daycare, and the kind of crisis that arrives with instructions written in someone else's handwriting. She's 3 years younger than me. We were never enemies. We weren't exactly friends either. Our family doesn't do enemies. We do patterns.
Erin has a decent heart and bad luck with men, which is another way of saying she chooses exactly the kind of promise that doesn't come with a payment plan. Her ex left quietly one morning and took the car without asking because the car was in his name. Erin's credit looked like someone had borrowed it for a bonfire. The girls were 5 and 3 and knew more about waiting rooms than anyone should at that age. In our house, my mom fits solutions around Erin like a quilt. My dad pretends to be stern and then leaves cash under the butter dish. The emergency they sold my car for wasn't cinematic. There was no ambulance, no fire. It was a call from a daycare director about a balance, a rent notice with a red banner, and a final payment due for one of Erin's medical bills that had been sitting on her fridge under a magnet shaped like a pineapple. The amount was the kind that looks small in a bank ad and enormous when you write numbers on receipts and line them across a table. My dad, with his name on my car, looked at his daughter, looked at the binder of maintenance records I had bragged about, and made a decision without me standing in the room. He drove the Subaru to a small lot in the strip between a tire shop and a nail salon and sold it for fast cash. He believed he was saving his daughter. He was also solving a problem using a tool that wasn't his to use anymore. I learned everything in a series of small conversations that couldn't possibly fit my anger. My mom tried to explain that they weren't stealing, they were reallocating. My dad said he intended to make it right. Erin cried in the driveway and swore she didn't know until after and that she hadn't asked for this particular solution. I believed all of them and still felt something important tilt inside me. You can love people and keep the receipt for what they cost you. Both things can be true. It's funny, the things you notice when you're trying not to shout. The empty shelving where I'd kept the torque wrench, the one grease handprint on a light switch from months ago that I suddenly couldn't bear to wipe away. The way the garage door opener made a slightly different sound without the extra 1,000 pounds of car on the concrete. My dad said a number out loud, the amount he got. And my brain did the math against the market without my permission. He'd undersold it by a few grand the way you do when you are selling regret as relief. I didn't stage an intervention or deliver a speech. I did what my therapist, who I see sporadically and pay on a sliding scale, would call collecting facts. I asked which lot, what date, whether there was a bill of sale. I took photos of the open space because I wanted to remember the shape of absence. I picked up the 10mm and put it in my pocket because I hadn't capped much else. There are a couple of ways the story could go if it were a movie. In one, I take my parents to court, win something that doesn't feel like winning, and leave with a broken relationship and a check that won't start in cold weather. In another, I trade cash for forgiveness and buy silence. The real way it went was less symmetrical and more human. I went back to my assignment and worked double shifts when I could. I stopped dropping by every other weekend so my presence wouldn't try to fix things by pushing crumbs into a pile and calling it cake. I muted the family thread for a week, and then I unmuted it because ignoring someone has the same energy as chasing them. I called the small lot. The guy at the lot was exactly who you think. He wore a smile like he's selling it and had a clipboard vocabulary. He remembered the car because of the binder. He said records twice with respect, which told me he lives on the same planet I do. He said he sold it in 4 days to a guy who knew what he was looking for. He couldn't give me a name, obviously, that's not how any of this works. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that the new owner had brought it back once to ask about a fuse. Nice kid, careful with money, paid cash. I asked if I could leave my number in case the nice kid ever wandered back in. He said sure, then threw the paper under the register where lost causes go to nap. I drove back to the motel with my heart doing a slow, annoying drum beat that felt like I'd failed a small test. I opened my laptop and searched Facebook groups the way people search for apartments when they're already in a lease, casually, obsessively. I looked for gray wagons with a particular dent on the hatch and a sticker on the rear glass from a coffee shop in town that had closed during the pandemic. I set alerts on the VIN on a site a friend sent me. I didn't expect anything. Hope is a habit, not a strategy. Some nights I thought about driving to Erin's place, sitting at her chipped kitchen table and asking her to account for every dollar that came from the car. Not to punish her, just to show her what anything costs when you're not turning the price over in your hand and calling it a feeling. But the older I get, the more I understand that spreadsheets don't change people who are bleeding. You stop the bleeding first, then you tell them they're going to have to learn their own bandage knots. What I did instead was smaller and, for me, harder. I called my dad and asked him to meet me at his credit union. I wanted the title situation done. He showed up in his chore jacket and the expression he wears when he knows he's going to be wrong for a while. The clerk recognized him because my family's money has lived in that building since I was 9 and got my first savings account with a pencil and a sticker. We moved the car off his record and into mine, even though the car wasn't in either of our garages. The clerk blinked at the empty line where the plate would go and shrugged in a way that said she's seen messier. On the way out, my dad touched my shoulder and said a sentence that was almost an apology and almost an instruction. I let it be both and neither. People don't change because you line up their mistakes like evidence. If they change at all, it's because the ground gets uncomfortable. 2 months later, my phone lit up with a message from a stranger at 10:43 p.m. "Sorry if this is weird. Are you the previous owner of a gray WRX wagon? I think I have your binder." He'd found my name on a service receipt stuck in a sleeve. He'd run it through Facebook and guessed correctly. He lived 2 towns over, taught art at the community college, and had a driveway that sloped like a skateboard ramp. He liked the car the way I did. He said it needed rear struts and a better alignment. He'd put a roof rack on it for his surfboard and looked up how to fix the hatch chip, but hadn't done it yet because he liked the story of it. We met on a Saturday morning when the air smelled like cut grass and grills warming up. He handed me the binder like he was returning a library book that had changed shape in his hands. I didn't do the thing where I made my family's crisis his problem. I told him the truth in non-weaponized sentences. I loved this car. It meant a lot. My parents sold it to help my sister. I would like to buy it back if he ever felt ready. He nodded in that slow human way that means he's keeping his answer in his mouth for now. He liked the car. He also liked feeling like part of someone else's better chapter. He said he'd think about it. I said that was all I could ask. While I waited for his version of time, I did the boring adult work my dad had skipped. I moved out of the motel loop and into a month-to-month studio 10 minutes from the firm. I ate food that wasn't gas station. I stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes and started checking it every 12. I called my mom once a week and told her about bridge decks and soil boring logs. She told me about the girls' school fundraiser and Aaron's new interview at a dental office. My dad asked whether I was changing my own oil in the little car the firm assigned me and pretended this was a normal conversation. In our family, love is a quiz you pass by knowing where the flashlights live. I'd like to tell you that the art teacher called with a price. I paid it and we all hugged and learned a lesson. It didn't go that way. He texted me a month later with a photo of the car and a sentence. He loved it, but the roof rack and the wagon didn't fit his life as well as he'd imagined. He could get more money selling to someone else, but he liked the idea of an object returning to its story. He asked for a fair number, market, not charity. It was more than the lot had given my dad, of course, and less than what strangers would pay, barely. I said yes and asked for a week. I sold a couple of things I'd convinced myself were part of my identity. A guitar I touched once a month, a set of speakers I used to make the news feel big, and 3 boxes of someday clothes that admitted they were costumes when I taped them shut. I pulled cash out of a savings account I hadn't wanted to touch and reminded myself that money is a tool, not a mood. I met the teacher on a weekday morning, handed him the cashier's check, and signed paperwork with a pen that did not make the moment special. When the engine turned over, my hands remembered the wheel. Some trees you grew up under, even if you didn't plant them. I didn't drive to my parents' house immediately. I took the long way home like people do when they're rehearsing the part where they don't flinch. I stopped at an empty lot behind the grocery store where my dad taught me stick on a different car a lifetime ago and let the clutch talk. The turbo sang at 3,000 and I remembered how to listen. I parked at the studio and sat in the driver's seat for a minute too long while the engine clicked, a small metal metronome for gratitude. When I finally went to my parents' place, I didn't rehearse. I pulled into the driveway, left the engine on until I saw my dad at the door, and then cut it so the silence could do its job. The look on his face was a mix of relief and surrender I hadn't seen since he watched me cross a stage in a rented robe. My mom stood behind him with a dish towel in her hands, the uniform she wears when she's trying to find a place for her hands to live. Aaron showed up 3 minutes later because families are radios and someone always forgets to turn down the volume. I didn't give speeches. I told them simply that I'd bought the car back, that I'd moved the title where it belonged, that the garage was not a storage unit for anyone else's emergencies anymore. I said I loved them and that one of the ways I would love them from now on would be by drawing lines before everyone was tired. Erin cried again, and this time it didn't make me feel like I was drowning. She told me she'd started at the dental office. It wasn't glamorous, but it was on a bus line and a schedule. The girls had new shoes, the rent was current, she was building credit the way I built a car, slow, begrudging, with instructions written by someone else. I believed her. I didn't hand her cash. Sometimes belief is the helpful part. Sometimes money is the lazy version of care. My dad tried to slide an apology into the room without a label. He said he'd been afraid. He said he'd done math with feelings and called it a plan. I told him I understood and that I was still angry sometimes in small, manageable ways that were my job to carry. We shook hands like men who hadn't learned how to do anything but shake hands when the hard part ended. My mom made coffee and lined up mugs like soldiers because habits are how you live with yourself afterward. The regret, if you're looking for it, didn't show up the way people want regret to show up. There was no cinematic scene of my parents collapsing into guilt. It was quieter and truer. It was my dad standing in the driveway and noticing the car wasn't backed into the garage this time. It was my mom reaching for the hook where the spare key used to hang and finding a blank wall. It was Erin paying a bill and not calling to celebrate because she didn't want to pair my forgiveness with a receipt. It was my parents realizing, slowly, that breaking trust doesn't just cost you an object, it costs you access to the easy version of your child. People asked me later whether I would have pressed charges if I hadn't gotten the car back. I don't live in that version of the story. I live in this one, where I did the most adult thing I could think of. I made a choice that was both expensive and correct, and I let time do what it does to people who are trying. I kept the Subaru. I kept the relationship. Altered, yes, but intact. I kept the 10mm socket in the glove box as a reminder that the things you lose can show up again if you learn how to look for them without tearing everything else apart. If you're wondering what changed after, very little and almost everything. I still drive to my parents' on Sundays sometimes and help my dad pretend to hate the cable company. I park in the driveway, I lock the car, I keep the title in a safe I pay for myself. Erin's girls climb into the back and eat goldfish crackers and ask if the star button makes the car go faster. I tell them the truth. A car keeps going because you take care of it when it's not moving. They roll their eyes the way kids do when you sneak a lesson into a story. That's all right. Maybe they'll remember the outline I left in the garage floor. Maybe they'll grow up and use boundaries like ramps.
There are still days when I open the hood and feel a small, mean spark when I think about what my father did. I don't blow on it. I note it and keep adjusting the throttle cable. I've learned the difference between punishment and consequence. I don't punish my parents for being who they are. I let the consequences of their choices live in the room with us. They feel it. They regret it in the way ordinary people regret, by telling less flattering stories about themselves and then choosing better the next time the ground starts to tilt. One afternoon, months later, my dad asked if I wanted to use the garage for a weekend to swap the rear struts. It would be easier, he said, with the bigger jack and the better light. I said yes. We pushed my mom's garden tools to the side and set the stands under the pinch welds. We worked mostly in comfortable silence. He handed me the 10mm when I asked without laughter. At some point, he put a rag down and said he had looked up the fair value of my car after he'd sold it. He said numbers, and I could hear that he had put the math and the shame in the same column. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Good. Forgiveness is not a task you assign to someone else. It's a thing you do in a room alone and then let leak out slowly if you're lucky. When we finished, the car sat a little higher and felt less tired over bumps. My dad wiped his hands on an old shirt and pointed at the floor where the clean rectangle had been the day I came home. You could still see the outline if you squinted, the memory of weight. He asked if I wanted to put the car there again for a picture. I told him I liked the driveway just fine. He nodded, and that nod felt like the most honest regret I'd get. It was enough. I drove back to my place as the sun fell behind rows of roofs. Out of light, I glanced in the rear view and saw the hatch chip catching gold just so. I didn't fix it. Some flaws you keep on purpose, not because you like looking at them, but because they tell the truth in the right amount. The turbo sang on an on-ramp, and I let it. The car was back. The line between me and my family was clearer. Both facts lived in my chest at the same time without arguing. That felt like adulthood. Sometimes people write to me now, friends, cousins of friends, telling me their version of this. A sibling in trouble, a parent making an emergency into an excuse, a thing that belonged to them not belonging anymore. They ask what I did to make my parents sorry. I tell them I didn't. I made them live with what they did while I built the life I could stand in. Regret arrived on its own schedule, the way weather does. What I did was practical. Bought my car back, moved the title, moved my boundaries, and kept showing up in rooms where love isn't perfect but has good bones. If you drive by a small studio apartment on the edge of town and see a gray wagon parked nose out like it wants to leave fast, that's mine. There's a 10mm in the glove box and a binder in the hatch that smells like old paper and lemon cleaner. I still wax it on Sundays sometimes with the radio low. Not to make it shine for strangers, but to remind myself that care looks like circles you can't see from the street. The garage at my parents' place has garden tools where the nose used to be. The floor still holds a whisper of where I learned what a boundary looks like in concrete. I step over it when I visit. I don't stand in it anymore.